There's something happening here.
Yeah, there sure is something happening here, and what it is ain't exactly clear. And Retake Our Democracy, with this radio show and with our blog and our Zoominars and with our alert system, tries to keep you informed about what's going on and ensure you can take action at the right time. So good morning. This is Retake Our Democracy on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. And today I'll be interviewing Kathleen Burke and Dick Mason, two advocates who will be pressing for the New Mexico State Legislature to pass legislation putting an independent redistricting commission on the ballot. And Kathleen Burke is the field officer, our coordinator of the Fair Districts New Mexico, and Dick Mason is the chair of the policy committee for the League of Women Voters. And we'll be talking with them in just a minute. But before we get to that, I wanted to remind you that last week I spoke with Eric Griego, the executive director of the Working Families Party and one of the architects of the transformation of the New Mexico State Legislature over the past 4 years. With Working Families Party, OLE, Indivisibles statewide, and Retake Our Democracy, the Albuquerque Interfaith Council, all of these organizations have been working together for the past 4 years. And it started by ousting Debbie Rodella and Carl Trujillo, and then supported a whole cadre of progressive Democrats elected to the New Mexico House in 2016, retaking the roundhouse. It had been under Republican control. In 2018, we strengthened the progressive membership in the House, leading to a 44-26 Democratic advantage that included a much more diverse, much younger, and much more female House Democratic caucus. And then in June of 2020, this coalition of organizations continued its work, unseating 5 Senate Democrats in name only. And because of this sustained effort, prospects for important legislation finally making its way to the governor's desk has been immeasurably improved. But there's much more to be done, and after winning the primary, we now must make sure we elect the challengers we supported and support new candidates who can further strengthen the progressive wing in the legislature. To that end, Retake has just published on Tuesday a set of general election priorities for candidates that we're supporting and a toolkit to help you get involved. So you can find the priorities and toolkit by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, hovering over the homepage menu above elections, and you will see our priorities and toolkit right there. Please visit it today. And one of the things I'm really hoping people will do is to form teams. Develop your own team of people who want to be engaged in this process. If you form a team, you know, it's going to be a remote team, that's for sure, because nowadays we can't get together as easily as we could. But by having a team working with you, you're far more likely to sustain your commitment to this work. And it's something where you just need to get out of your comfort zone. Not a lot of people look forward to making phone calls to strangers, but we've got to do that. We can't canvass, we can't do town halls. And so it's going to be very, very, very important that we buckle down and get this done. And you can listen to the interview that I had with Eric Griego and other prior shows by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and hovering over the Actions and Events menu. And you'll find Retake Conversations, and click on that, and bingo, you'll have these shows at your fingertips, including the show today that we're just about to start. So I would like to welcome Kathleen and Dick, and we'll get started. Welcome, you guys.
Thank you.
Are you all unmuted? We're ready to go. Okay, so I would like to let our guests introduce themselves. And so can each of you, we'll start with Kathleen. If you can indicate, how you got into activism in general, and then more specifically in relation to redistricting.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Paul. My name is Kathleen Burke. I have been highly politically involved in New Mexico since 2015. I coordinate the Fair Districts New Mexico project. I was recruited onto the project as a political consultant by the League of Women Voters of New Mexico in 2019. And I work hand in hand now with 19 mostly local and some national organizations, including our esteemed partners, the Brennan Center for Justice and the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. Our goal is to reform redistricting in New Mexico, essentially by taking redistricting power away from the hands of those in power and placing it instead in the hands of the electorate.
Great, great. Dick, would you like to add something? Well, tell us who you are first.
Yeah, first of all, my name is Dick Mason, and I'm chair of the Action Committee of the League of Women Voters of New Mexico. I'm too old to tell you how long I've been involved, but it started with the Bobby Kennedy campaign in 1968, so I'll start there. Okay.
Me too.
The League of Women Voters in Mexico is the state organization, but we have 4 local leagues: Santa Fe County, Los Alamos, Central New Mexico, and Southern New Mexico. The League of Women Voters was founded 100 years ago in order to encourage women to use their newly obtained right to vote and to participate in the political process. And yes, for the last 40 years, they accept male members. I've been a member for 26 years. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization, maybe best known for our voters' guides to provide voters with nonpartisan information on voting process, candidates, and ballot questions. And we're excited this year that the League of Women Voters in New Mexico has kicked off our Vote 411 online services that provides online voting information to voters. Over the years, the League has also developed positions on many issues, and those positions are developed after exhaustive study. And that is how we developed our position on redistricting reform. And Paul, can I just clarify one thing? It is too late to put an independent redistricting commission on the ballot for 2021 redistricting because of the legislative process. So we are pushing for a fairer, a more transparent, and more accountable redistricting process in 2021. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. We'll talk a lot more about that, and just wanted to date myself as well, because my activism began by canvassing for Bobby Kennedy in California primary. Was at the Biltmore Hotel. I was at the Biltmore Hotel when he was killed. So it's
one of the worst days of my life.
One of the worst days of mine. One of the worst. All right. Well, on that cheery note, let's move on to talk a little bit about the redistricting process and some of the background information about gerrymandering. And Kathleen, can you just give us a bit of information about that, in particular with a focus on New Mexico?
Well, I'll start off answering your question, Paul, by talking about gerrymandering's prevalence in New Mexico historically, and then I'll turn it over to Dick to talk a little bit more about that. So in the United States, gerrymandering has been happening probably since 1800, which was the first US Census. At that time, I think we can safely assume that gerrymandering did begin happening in a probably rather unaffected manner. And then it was in 1812 when gerrymandering actually became recognized as a tactic by name, and that was in Massachusetts. Then, so in New Mexico, we know that since New Mexico statehood, we have a long history of gerrymandering here, and of having our redistricting maps litigated and decided by our courts. Just as some interesting background information as well, it was from 1960 until 1991 that New Mexico was actually forced to get pre-clearance by the United States Department of Justice regarding our maps. And that's pre-clearance to assure that the maps approved by the legislature and the governor also complied with federal standards for fair representation. So that period was 1960 until 1991, that we were being overseen by the Department of Justice. Then again, unfortunately, in 1995, once again, the United States Department of Justice had to step in and require pre-clearance for New Mexico maps because it was the 1992 amended maps, which again violated the standards due to minority misrepresentation, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So with that, I'll turn it back to Dick and let Dick talk to you a little bit more on some background on what has happened regarding redistricting in our state. Dick?
Yeah.
Okay. Paul, I would like to first of all start out so that people understand how redistricting happens in New Mexico. So in New Mexico, the New Mexico Constitution gives the authority for redistricting to the legislature, and they're responsible for redistricting the congressional seats, the Public Regulation Commission, the Public Education Commission, and the New Mexico House and Senate districts. And by federal law, it's required to be done after the census. The next one will be in 2021. Since it is done by statute, that means that it has to be done be signed by the governor. So that is the basic process, just so people understand, the process by our Constitution, how redistricting is done in New Mexico.
Okay. So, Kathleen, what are the ways that the electorate is most affected by gerrymandering? I mean, why does it matter?
Yeah, good question. So gerrymandering has this insidious way of disempowering voters. If you are part of a community which has been systemically marginalized by a gerrymandering, it becomes all too easy for policymakers, i.e. elected officials, to ignore you. If that elected official knows that his or her party can assure his or her incumbency or reelection by redrawing the district lines, that elected official, unfortunately, may lose the impetus to listen to your concerns. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that. Not only may you be ignored, it is highly likely. The effects of this are deleterious and widespread. There are many studies available now nationwide attributing many disparities, including child wellness, child education, to gerrymandering. This is wholesale disempowerment of people, which must stop. If people have given up hope on their government, it is highly possible that gerrymandering of their locale over some time created that hopelessness.
So, Dick, the last 3 redistricting processes in New Mexico were conducted by Republican governors and Democratic control of both legislative chambers. So, and unless there's a big change, though, and we don't expect this, this time it's going to be all Democrats, a trifecta in both chambers and the governors. How did the 2011 process unfold, and how is the 2021 process likely to differ?
The 2011 process just started with, and first of all, I want to say I encourage people to sign on to the webinar that Retake is doing, because Senator Ortiz-Pino, who was on that redistricting committee, is going to be talking about that process. Okay, so the way it happened was in March 2011. It wasn't done until 2011 that the legislature passed a bill creating an 18-member interim redistricting committee, 9 appointed by the House Speaker and 9 appointed by the Senate Committee on Committees. And then the Legislative Council, which is the interim committee, They met in May and they appointed the committee. Appointed the committee members.
So were they different? There was its interim, and then there.
Well, they didn't in the session. They just made the legislation and gave the power to appoint the committee members to the Legislative Council.
Okay.
Okay. They also adopted guidelines, and they were guidelines. They weren't required, And one of the things that the League has an issue with, that allowed incumbency to be considered. In other words, they could consider where the existing legislature lived when drawing districts. So, with the consultant, which was Brian Sanderoff, Research and Polling, drew the maps. Then they went out and had 8 public meetings, and the legislators who were on it will tell you they were a dog and pony show. The public input had relatively little to do with the final maps. So then he went into special session in September of 2011. They met up until September 21st, and quite honestly, the meetings weren't very open, and most people would tell you that the maps were actually drawn in caucus, not on any open meeting. So then they sent the Senate map and the state Senate map and the state House map to the legislature. She vetoed them.
That wasn't a surprise.
And then ensued a number of lawsuits from Native American communities, Democratic Party, a number of them. So in December, at the end of December, Judge Hall, who was appointed by the Supreme Court to basically write the maps. But the final House maps weren't actually fixed until February 29th, 2012. That was 2 months. I mean, it was 2 weeks before candidates had to file for the House seats. So they didn't even know what district they were in, okay? So the total cost of the total redistricting process was $8 million. And $3 million of that was the legal cost, because the Supreme Court ruled that the state had to pay for the lawsuits that were filed by advocates and other organizations. So it was a total mess. And quite honestly, 2001 wasn't much better. And from the League of Women Voters viewpoint, I mean, there is what goes on, and the process not being transparent, and basically legislators choosing their constituents versus constituents choosing their legislators. But the other thing is the League believes in the legislative process, of the political process. And when the public sees this type of thing going on, it undercuts their confidence in the political process. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the biggest impacts of what has happened in redistricting in New Mexico.
So let me, I need to take a little bit of a break and remind our listeners that it is in times like this that KSFR is more important than ever, offering timely news, great music, alerts about what's going on, and shows like this. And they help keep you sane while you're sheltered in place. And I hope you're doing that and wearing your masks, because I don't know if you've been paying attention, but we're experiencing a spike here in New Mexico and in Santa Fe, precisely because people are letting their guards down. So we got to keep with the masks and social distancing. But for those of you who can afford it, KSFR could really use some change. And so if you go to ksfr.org and click on the donate menu, you can make a $10, $15, $20,000 donation. Any of the above would work. And they got to keep the lights on. They got sound engineers and everything else. And that's what enables all of the volunteer radio hosts like myself to do our shows. So if you want to keep hearing this kind of thing, you got to pay for it once in a while. So I'd appreciate your doing so. I want to remind you also that today we're talking with Kathleen Burke of Fair Districts, New Mexico, and Dick Mason with the New Mexico League of Women Voters. And Dick was just telling us a bit about what had transpired in 2011 during the redistricting process. And so I'm interested, the last 3 times we've done this, the House and Senate have differed in control than the governor. Right now, it's a trifecta. And I believe Speaker Egolf and others think that this is their chance to really create districts that will make it very difficult for that to change. So what do you foresee in your crystal ball come next session or the special session that follows?
Well, I'll go first on that, Paul. The league believes that we have to put sunshine on this process. And believe me, the legislators have already heard. Unlike 2011, the league worked on redistricting in 2011. We couldn't get anybody interested. Redistricting, the public is watching now. That's why we have 15 organizations already signed on Fair Districts New Mexico. So just to give you, just recently, the New Mexico First has been funded to convene a redistricting task force to be made up of influential stakeholders. Now, the membership hasn't been decided yet, to develop criteria and recommendations to the 2021 legislative process on how we can make the system fairer and more transparent and more accountable. And we've floated a number of ideas. Something like a temporary redistricting commission, which the legislature can create. We can put the criteria for good redistricting in statute so that they have to follow that. There is a number of things that we can do to make the system fairer and more transparent.
Okay. So how would an independent redistricting commission come about? And how would one function to prevent what we've heard already? Kathleen, can you fill us in a little bit on that?
Well, we are hoping that our newly forming redistricting task force will recommend an independent redistricting commission. Actually, it's my hope that that's their #1 priority is that we set up a commission like a number of other states have done already before us. And so an independent redistricting commission is made up by people who are proven to know what they're doing, to know a lot about demography, geography, setting districts, etc. They are people from various sides of the aisle, people who are considered nonpartisan as well, and people who are authorities like representatives from the governor's office, maybe the Secretary of State herself. We'll see what the task force says about that. But an independent redistricting commission, they're highly controlled in that there are lots of ways, there's lots of oversight so that these commissions do act in the public interest and in a nonpartisan manner. That's one of the concerns of both legislators and the public currently is that, so we set up this whole another layer of bureaucracy, let's say, which is a redistricting commission. How do we know that that new redistricting commission is going to be above board? How do we know that they're not going to cheat or work for the wishes of one party or the other? Well, that's what I'm talk about when I'm saying we have, there are ways to provide a lot of oversight to these commissions. Yeah. And so that's one answer to getting this accomplished. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel. A number of other states have already done this, and they're doing it successfully. And so we feel that might be the way to achieve fair redistricting in New Mexico. Is it going to happen in 2021? Well,
No.
Maybe, maybe not. Maybe not. With a likely no, because of various, powers that are already in play. But we do feel that by doing what we're doing now, we and our partners, including Retake Our Democracy, including the many other organizations who are supporting this effort, we can achieve a fair redistricting process, have it in place by the next redistricting cycle in 2031. So that's the goal. And, the sooner we can get that done, the better. Have it in place so that a task force and a commission is somewhat watertight by the time 2031 rolls around.
Okay. I do want to, can I just clarify on this?
Sure.
New Mexico First is going into this with no specified priority for what what they're going to be recommending to the legislature. So I should make, that clear. And, I do not think it is likely that we will come up with an independent redistricting commission, because that would have to be by statute, in 2021. We're more likely to come up with some other option that'll make the system fairer and more transparent.
Something like a memorial to set a task force to put together a set of criteria and a process for getting to an independent commission.
Well, the independent commission, we want it to be done by constitutional amendment so that it can't be changed. And that means it can't go on the ballot till 2022 right now.
Right.
So, most of the organizations, I'll be clear about it, the League of Women Voters and most of the organizations in the Fair Districts Coalition want an independent redistricting commission by constitutional amendment. But we want to make the 2021 system fairer and more transparent.
I see. So you've got two challenges here.
Yeah.
We've got about 2 more minutes. The radio show. We will take a brief pause of about 5 seconds at the end, and then return and complete our conversation for a recording that will be available online at retakeourdemocracy.org within minutes of when the show airs on Saturday. But we could start by talking just a little bit about why is it so difficult to get this done? I thought that naively that with a Democratic controlled House and everything last time, it could get done. And then I started thinking, like, no, the Democrats are licking their chops. They got a chance to do this payback to the Republicans. So is that really what it comes down to, why we couldn't get anything done in 2021?
Yes. People in power don't like to give up power.
I've noticed that.
Simple as and one other thing I want to say, a lot of the deals have been made, particularly in the Senate, have been more about incumbency protection than they've been about partisan politics. Now, that may change in this cycle, but some people feel that Albuquerque lost a seat because they were trying to take care of some of the rural areas, which is good in some ways. But, there are deals made many times to protect incumbents.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk a bit more about that when we get back to our podcast. Right now, I just want to remind you, you're listening to retakeourdemocracy.org, Retake Our Democracy on KSFR. And we'll be having a Zoominar with both of these folks and Senator Jerry Ortiz-Pino, my favorite legislator, and Senator Mark Moores, a Republican from Albuquerque, on Tuesday, July 21st from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And you can go to retakeourdemocracy.org and click on the actions and events page, and you'll be able to see, not on the page itself, but hover over that menu, and you'll be able to find the Zoominar series where you can sign up for this Zoominar. We've already got it half full, so you're going to want to do that soon. And we'll be back next week. I'm not quite sure who I'm going to be talking to, so you're going to just have to tune in. But stay safe, stay healthy, and above all, stay hopeful. We've got a lot to do, and let's do it together. So we'll be back next week. And by the miracle of podcast, we're back. And we were talking a little bit about what impedes us from getting a redistricting commission or even just a fair redistricting process. And I believe it's the League of Women Voters that published the 30-page report on redistricting. It was Redistricting 39. I can't remember, but Kathleen sent it to me. And it's extraordinarily good. I'm going to put a link to that on our website, because it really lays out the whole thing you were saying, Dick, about incumbency being what's really protected, and that it's not as partisan as you would think it is. So I highly recommend that to listeners.
Paul, can I just clarify that?
Yes.
The Thornburg Foundation funded New Mexico in depth to do that study.
Oh, okay.
It is great.
Yes, it really is. It's an excellent report, and it was what made me realize the whole incumbency thing and what happened in 2011, which, you know, going through the courts and stuff like that. I'm kind of curious. This wasn't, you know, transparency. We're talking about transparency. So transparency, when we do these radio shows, the folks being interviewed have the questions in advance, can prepare, can think about it, and then every once in a while I throw something out there. You know, we were talking, Kathleen was talking about how I tried to do it on the podcast part, you know, so it's not like live radio. But Kathleen had mentioned that, you know, it's important to have people like cartographers on a commission if they're going to do this kind of thing. And one of the things that occurred to me is, when a judge gets something like this thrown in their lap, I mean, this is a real expertise. You've got to understand some things. How did the judge in 2011 and 12 create maps for the state? I mean, they must have started with what the legislature had done or something. How do they do that?
Let me tell you, Brian Sandera from Research and Polling presented, he drew the original maps, okay, that the legislature started working with and went out to the public. He presented to the League of Women Voters just after you draw those maps. Those maps were pretty good because he was using, you know, the federal criteria and everything else. He had no political agenda, okay? And so the judge can go back to those, but the judges have made it clear they don't want this.
Right.
Okay. One of the things, you know, Senator Ortiz-Pena, you know, one of the alternatives he looks at is, let's just give it to 3 judges, retired judges in the first place, you know, so that they can have time and everything else to look at it. You know, another idea that may work, I don't know. There are pluses and minuses to that, but they don't want it. But you're right. They are, particularly with a time crunch. And I just want to mention one more thing that's going to make this redistricting process even more difficult. Because of the pandemic, we aren't going to get the census data until which usually delivered by March 31st. We're not going to get it at the earliest till July 31st, 2021.
Yeah.
It is going to compact the whole process even more.
Oh boy. Lots to look forward to.
Yeah.
So, Kathleen, can you just tell us, one of the things you mentioned when we were talking on the phone was that gerrymandering affects different populations in different ways, and in particularly has impacted communities of color. Can you lay out how that plays out?
Sure, I'm happy to. You know, Paul, tragically, minorities, especially Black communities, have suffered gerrymandering since the founding of this nation. It was inherent in the redistricting process that Black voters have been either dispersed among various districts so as to always be a powerless minority, or they've been pushed into conglomerations, which is another form of disempowerment. but particularly the one that we've seen mostly is what we call cracking, where minority populations are broken down into many districts so that there are many districts in which that minority remains a small minority within its district. Again, we call that cracking in redistricting language. So gerrymandering via cracking is an example of systemic racism. It is a form of divide and conquer. If persons of color are kept to a small minority in many districts, they remain that, a minority with little or no voice. Their concerns, their agenda, if you will, becomes negligible. Once this takes root, disempowerment has set in, and eventually hopelessness does take over. Communities of color have experienced this repeatedly across this country since its founding. Not only is the agenda of the minorities dismissed, it essentially becomes impossible for anyone from that marginalized community of color to ever have the opportunity to rise up to a position of policy making, such as a legislator. You've seen that, and you will see it. Anyone who joins the webinar on Tuesday night will see there's a really good example of that in a video that we show. And Paul actually put that in on his blog today. So if you have a chance to look at the Retake Our Democracy blog of today, July 16th, you'll see a really good example where minority candidates are pushed out.
Is this the one with John Oliver where he showed this one candidate who in
Right, yeah.
Park who was just like one block was cut out of the district?
Right. Perfect example, Paul.
You know, but I do want to point out that in New Mexico, the major disenfranchising has been Native Americans. That has been, you know, why the DOJ has come in. Somewhat Hispanic communities, but mainly dissipating the support, the power of Native American communities in New Mexico. And luckily, that violates federal law, okay? The Supreme Court punted on a lot of things, but still, the Department of Justice can intervene on that, and lawsuits can be brought. So,
yeah, Dick's right, and it's really interesting. Some of the partners in Fair Districts New Mexico joined us in this effort simply not simply, but with the priority being that we make this right for Native American populations. And we feel the same. Everyone must be treated equal, but in New Mexico itself, it's the Native populations which have suffered the most. You know, their voices are not heard. Their issues have become irrelevant. They lose the ability to be represented, much less to be a representative themselves. You know, the income handicap of people of color contributes to the problem as well. Poor communities, regardless of race, become disempowered. The International District here in Albuquerque, for example, that's one perfect example where we have mixed races and predominantly low income. Here, there is a long history of struggles with gerrymandering, and this is sad but true.
Okay. So Kathleen, you described how districts and boundaries belong to people, not to politicians. Can you explain that notion?
Sure. I think that we, the electorate, are mostly unaware of or we've become inured to the fact that politicians and political parties, oftentimes controlled by private interests, i.e. corporations, have actual ownership of our district boundaries. You know, we have somehow missed that is what the reality is today, that in a sense, political entities have co-opted ownership of our boundary making. But those districts and boundaries and their making still belong to us, to we the people. And it is up to us to take back the driver's seat in this process. And that's why we're here.
Okay. Last question. And then actually, before we go to the last question, I just wanted to make a comment and see if you wanted to amplify on it. One of the things I read, and I don't know if it was in that the booklet that we were referencing that In Depth did, but was that 90% of House of Representatives across, we've been talking more about, you know, the state legislature, but in terms of, especially in more populous states, the congressional maps are of critical importance. And it was amusing to see that in New Mexico, when they were redoing the congressional districts, Ben Ray Lujan was in Congress and his father was in charge of redoing the district maps for Congress. And I'm just going like, no conflict of interest there. But what was shocking was that 90% of congressional representatives are reelected. I mean, they just retire or decide to do or become a lobbyist and make even more money. And that just tells you that the process of creating these maps must not be so much about partisanship as it is about incumbency. And I think when we were talking about incumbency being what motivates things at the break in the live show, Dick, you were starting to talk about that. How does that work? I mean, because I've been in the Roundhouse, for example, quite a bit the last 4 years. I don't see a lot of bipartisan cooperation. How do they coalesce around, let's just keep things like they are, and we can all keep our seats? How does that transpire?
If you want to see bipartisanship, you should be in a meeting where, I mean, in a congressional, I mean, a hearing where the League or Common Cause presents about redistricting reform. You will see bipartisan cooperation. We've been slammed by both Republicans and Dems, particularly those in power, you know? So the Senate, you see it more in the Senate than you do in the House. And I think Senator Tizipini will be able to talk better about this. Mm-hmm. They go into caucus and they trade. The Dems trade precincts, the Republicans trade precincts, they come together, okay, we'll make a deal, we'll do this, you know, okay? So it's, and you know, the senator will tell you this, almost all the decisions are made in the two caucuses, okay? And because we've had Republican governors in the last 3 sessions, you had to pay some attention, you know, to the Republican seat. But in the Senate in particular, generally how the Senate is more collegial,
right,
than the House. You've noticed that, okay?
Yes.
So, but they make deals, you know, like I said, the two caucuses. Now, whether that will be the case, you know, we are in new territory with the Democrats being in control of both chambers and the governorship. We will see.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
I remember I floated that term buddymandering.
Yes.
Buddymandering, where they kind of buddy up, the two parties, and decide how things are going to be.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The powers that be behind closed doors. I could just see these maps floating from the Democratic caucus in the House where they're drawing up precincts and stuff, and then somebody runs it across the hall that the Republicans say, "Well, can you take this?" And ultimately, they arrive at something. But you know, in the blog that we did on Tuesday, and we're listening to this on Saturday, but the Thursday blog had pictures of the maps for the state of New Mexico for the House and the Senate, and some of these districts are just surreal. And then even the ones that aren't, you see these little like crevices or peninsulas that are probably just a few blocks just to capture a precinct or something. And you got to wonder what was in play there. You know, you got to wonder. So,
well, if you have a second, just so from my own personal experience, if you can't tell from my accent, I'm originally from Massachusetts.
I had that one.
Yes. The president of our Senate was Billy Bulger, who is Whitey Bulger's brother. And number one on the FBI most wanted list. So he was challenged by this young activist, Brian McFadden, and he blew the Senate president away because Brian got 48% of the vote. This was in 1998. And next redistricting, there was the district beside the Senate president was fairly concise, except there was this little thing, Phil pointed out, that captured Brian McFadden's house and put it in someone else's ticket. We used to call it the McFadden finger. That's what it looked, but it was sort of like the same one that John Oliver said. I mean, it is, sometimes it's just outrageous.
And pretty cutthroat, pretty cutthroat. So last question for both of you, and it's just an easy one. For listeners who want to learn more about the possible commission and what you're going to be trying to do in the 2021 legislative session, how do they get more information?
Kathleen?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Yes, if you're interested, please do contact us. We'd love to have you involved. You can go to our website, please. We can be found at www.fairdistrictsnm.org. That's fairdistrictsnm, all one word, .org. As well, we're on Facebook at Fair Districts for New Mexico, and we hope you'll join us.
Yeah, and what she's saying she wants you to join in on is our Zoominar on Tuesday, July 31st from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And if you want to get, and we're going to have 2 state senators on, and it's going to be the first time I've ever had a Republican on my radio show or my Zoominar. Mark Moores, the senator from Albuquerque, will be joining Jerry Ortiz-Pino, the senator from Albuquerque, and a Democrat, very progressive Democrat, I might add. And Dick and Kathleen will be there as well. So go to retakeourdemocracy.org, hover over the actions and events page, go to the Zoominar series page, click on register, and you're in the room, in the Zoom room. And we'll be back next week with another Retake Conversation. And thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Dick, for joining me. And we'll see you on Tuesday.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.